Hello everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to be presenting at OE Global in 2020. I'm going to be presenting my doctoral research, which just finished last year, and I had the pleasure to present during several times at this conference. And I think it's a good opportunity to summarize some of the key concepts and start a discussion about the accessibility of MOOCs. So this presentation, insights from stakeholders on designing accessible MOOCs, will show the perspective of designing accessible MOOCs, considering opinions from the different people involved in its design and development. We need to understand and consider the benefits that it has for students to participate in a MOOC learning environment. It can be the openness and its low cost, even we are aware that is not the case in many MOOC platforms anymore, but at least in its origins and some MOOC initiatives nowadays. Its ubiquity, so mostly the possibility for any learner to work in their own time, place, and pace. The possibility to get a new knowledge, which can be very relevant for those students who might have less access. As well, the possibility to interact with other students, achieve new competencies, and that knowledge that is acquired can be certified and developed professionally. We have to realize that in the literature review and considering accessibility in MOOCs and the potential for learners with accessibility needs, there is not much been done yet, in the sense that most studies consider only one type of disability, of mostly those who declare visual impairment, and only particular MOOCs, particular platforms. There is no holistic approach trying to understand accessibility of MOOCs. So when designing my doctoral research, I thought it was important to consider the perspective of the stakeholders. For that reason, my research questions try to address different perspectives. So how do MOOC providers cater for disabled learners? What are the motivations of disabled learners when taking part in MOOCs? And how can MOOCs be made accessible for disabled learners? So for question 1 and 2, it was interesting to have interviews actually with those stakeholders and learners, as well as acquiring data from online surveys to help to answer the information regarding disabled learners when answering these surveys online. And for the last one, which is transversal, included getting information from both sources in the interviews, online survey data, and the audit itself, that is MOOC accessibility audit that we'll describe later, but was designed at OC to consider accessibility in MOOCs. Research question 3 has 2 sub-questions, so needs to consider the current state of accessibility of MOOCs and how can accessibility barriers in MOOCs be identified and addressed in order to actually make them accessible. In that sense, the research design included 3 studies. The first one tried to answer that perspective of MOOC providers. That includes those who design the courses embedded in platforms and those who actually provide the platforms, and people who are in the area of research of MOOCs and accessibility. And in order to answer the third research question, to improve the accessibility, so there were 26 interviews with those MOOC providers. Then another study after the first one, so the studies were alongside one after the other. This one was most about the perspective of those learners with accessibility needs, and as well get their insights to improve the accessibility of MOOCs. So it involved 14 pre and post MOOC online surveys from FutureLearn platform and from courses from the Open University, and as well 15 interviews with disabled learners who were part of those courses. Finally, there was a third study, which is a more human-computer interaction study, which devises a MOOC accessibility audit in order to focus on the third research question for the accessibility of MOOCs. That one included a process to validate the audit itself and to design it and to validate it with 10 experts that included integrated reliability with those experts to validate the results and the process of the audit itself. It involved 4 MOOCs from FutureLearn, edX, Coursera, and Canvas to cover different perspectives in the process. So the audit itself has four main components. The accessibility evaluation has to do with VCAC 2.0 in that case. There are new guidelines, but that's the one used in this case for the audit itself. VCAC guidelines have already four key areas and principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I added a new one, which is text-based files that are quite common and appear as educational resources in MOOCs. And as well, the user experience evaluation that had to do with experience in another project, OLA, and was about creating scenarios and using personas that actually evolved from those from the interviews in the study B that involved these different stages for a scenario. So the platform is design and access, like the first starting point, working with different educational resources, working in particular areas very common in MOOCs, such as discussions, assignments, which can be peer-to-peer with several students, and the tests and the quizzes. The ways to report help and feedback in the area of accessibility, and considering as well aspects of the MOOC design itself during the workload of the MOOC. The quality in that case had three key aspects and was as well something common from several EDTU projects. That involves MOOC criteria, the quality of the design, the technical platform, and support for learners. So these aspects are more about the quality of the learning in MOOCs and overlapping several aspects. So because the accessibility audit allows that redundancy in different aspects. And finally, the learning design, which for that process we use Universal Design for Learning, UDL framework, and it implied the development of checklists for the evaluation of the multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. So that covers as well the learning design. So this audit had two purposes: to cover the technical aspects, but as well learning design aspects. And for that reason, the audit was designed as four different components, but that share the same structure. These are the principles, but there were lower levels like as guidelines, and then different checklists that could be actually the ones that were evaluated individually. So which are the contributions of this research to knowledge? So actually, how do MOOC providers cater for disabled learners? Well, we have to be aware that there is a lack of data on accessibility in MOOCs, as well as providers think that MOOCs are useful and can help all those learners with accessibility needs. But there is a strong dependency on legislation, and that's what's driving accessibility. So learners are not first, and their needs are not first. It's about following book of rules, so following the legislation, and not really focus on the learning and perspective and needs for the students when participating in platforms and courses. As well, they notice that there is a need for improvement in the way learners might need to find help and report accessibility barriers in a way that is actually meaningful and helpful for them with a quick response, which is not always the case in MOOCs. Motivations for learners themselves, it was that actually they were obviously interested in the educational subjects proposed by MOOCs, and the fact that it allowed them to work in a flexible environment and quite friendly, and the fact of being low cost in many cases, or in the MOOCs they were trying to participate, and for their professional development it was something useful. So this was something interesting to get to know. In order to understand actually how to make MOOCs more accessible, it's important to notice that barriers identified during the process, so the interviews and the audit itself, the barriers are not, this is about mostly the interviews talking with learners, barriers are not necessarily related to technical aspects or disabilities. There is a scope for improvement in accessibility. So you might have to be with personal situations that might involve any learner in terms of having to finish a task in a time frame, and that being quite difficult with other commitments in the private life, but can be actually linked with accessibility needs and disabilities. The limitations of MOOC production to provide dynamic solutions to accessibility barriers. So the learners were being proactive and providing responses to the barriers they were facing, but that doesn't mean that actually the solutions they would like to find were in place. And indeed, because of the massiveness of MOOCs, it's quite difficult to provide those solutions quick when a student or learner reports a barrier. That's a quite common case. So some key recommendations to consider when designing and working accessibility MOOCs is at platform level, we need to consider to be responsive and multiple device design. So it's not always that straightforward, that we need to keep the consistency in the design and structure when in the main page, when accessing the MOOCs, when working through the MOOCs, as well to try to include built-in applications. So it's quite common for students to maybe have some kind of a spell corrector or a calculator and stuff like maybe it's not straightforward to have in all operating systems or browsers. Processes need to be simpler. In some cases, we noticed that it wasn't easy to register and participate straightforward in logging into the MOOC. MOOC search, so most platforms have a search engine. It should be easy to work with. They should provide different types of filters that are totally meaningful for students, and doesn't need to be always about subjects, but can be topics of interest. So try to embrace different ways to search the information. Allow personalization, so try to let students have configuration of several default values, and that can persist over different sessions. So for example, it might be really useful to have the captions available in a particular language and not having to actually habilitate them every time you're, for example, gonna watch a new video. And as well to have a particular area in the profile where students can store their goals and self-reflection. So it's not only about doing the things offline, it's as well allowing spaces between the MOOC for having some personalization of the work through the MOOC. For example, as well, in terms of the information provided in the first page of the MOOC, try to offer structured information and differentiation between target groups. So we need to consider that not all learners are same group. So we need to offer different learning goals, different objectives for different groups. Leave clear information about the previous knowledge needed. It's not always clear what you need to know before participating in a MOOC, and that can create frustration and drop out later. And provide some syllabus with the key information that is going to be disclosed week per week, and provide that information straightforward from the beginning. Don't disclose it after week per week terms. In terms of the MOOC design, so you should be able to access the content different ways. So it shouldn't be linear. You should be able to jump over and have a look to things that you're going to be studying. So have some flexibility in terms of accessing the content, and try to provide it from the beginning. The option of opening content week by week doesn't really work for everyone. Some learners might like to advance because they know they might have problems in the future, or some situations where actually it might just help to go through the MOOC as much as possible in one time sitting in front of the computer. And it's quite useful as well to have available always a glossary with common words and abbreviations and extra educational resources that might be helpful for some learners who want to enrich content and might have some previous knowledge required that might be helpful to review. Regarding the information that is about the syllabus and workload per week. We should provide always study guides and consider different levels of difficulty in the workload for different learners and different needs. The educational resources should consider in terms of videos to be short, to keep the attention accurate, subtitles and captions, as well as transcripts, and provide handouts and in text-based files, and if possible provide several languages that can be achievable through the use of subtitles in different languages as well as transcripts. Try to provide educational resources in different formats when possible. It can be a map, it can be an image, it can be text. In terms of the discussions, try to organize the discussions by themes and topics, which are easier to find out than having long conversations where it's difficult to find what you are looking for. And try to provide a consistent feedback mechanism during the discussions. In terms of the assignments, the instructions should be clear and designed in different formats so students can work with assignments in a way that fits better their learning goals. Consider as well that feedback in tests and quizzes has to be linked to educational resources, and try to avoid including limits in quizzes, and try to be flexible in the number of times you can participate in those quizzes, because those don't affect the evaluation of the MOOC, and some students might need more time or might need to access several times. Just allow them that. And finally, try to provide technical and learning guides and discussions which are focused on getting help and can help students to ask for accessibility barriers as well. And it can be quite useful to provide question marks icons to be more context-sensitive orientation, in order to ask for help. That can be as well in the way of a help button, where you can go straight forward to raise an accessibility awareness and accessibility need. Some implications from my research: I have a greater knowledge of the MOOC stakeholders and their thoughts in accessibility, and I've provided a MOOC accessibility audit which can be reused and devised for evaluating the accessibility of MOOCs, and a set of recommendations which I've just explained. And it benefits both MOOC providers and learners. We need to consider in the future, and in empirical research, include more comparative studies from different types of learners, other sources of data. We have to consider richer sources, for example, learning analytics or surveys. The audit needs to be improved and probably simplified. It's quite a long audit, but helps with lots of information and pointers. The involvement of stakeholders in accessibility, so how these results can actually be helpful for them, and development of future guidelines to check the accessibility in design time. One of the limitations is the representativeness in terms of not all MOOC providers having part, and not all disabilities and particular needs of students might have been considered. But two big important conclusions are that MOOC providers need a better understanding of their learners and who is participating in the MOOCs and the needs they might have, and as well they need to consider an inclusive design approach in MOOC development. So it's not about legislation, it's not about doing the minimum, it's about thinking in an inclusive way to benefit all learners. Thank you very much. There is my email and contact, and I will be available during the conference for any query.